Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And this fortnight we are coming to you live from inside the time vortex because, full disclosure listeners, it has not been a fortnight since we last recorded, it's actually been about half an hour. But we will both be away for most of the 2 weeks after we released the last episode. We'll both be at Nine Worlds, at least at some stage, and then Alastair's off to Worldcon and I'm off on a non-geek culture related holiday. I know. Why? So yes, because we care, we've preloaded this episode, set thoroughly in the past, where we talk about some old things. Specifically, we've done a double recommendation. I've recommended Alastair Daredevil Born Again, the classic story by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli, and Alastair has recommended me Withnail and I, the grim British comedy starring Paul McGann and Richard E. Grant. So we will be covering those two things. It might be a bit shorter than usual, but at least it exists. Oh, and there's a small chance we might be able to record a bit of extra audio at Nine Worlds, which if we do, I'll delicately sprinkle in throughout the episode, and if we don't, I'll probably delete this bit. But yeah, if you hear a noise and then we start talking with a slightly more background noise, then that's what's happened. But anyway, yep, on that note, we'll get on to our double recommendation in a few minutes. But first, Alastair, what media, if any, have you consumed in the 15-20 minutes since we finished recording the last episode?
Well, my girlfriend is currently downstairs watching Logan, so I have consumed about 2 minutes worth of Logan, and I was reminded that it is a very good film, probably the best thing I've seen so far this year. So, so other than Logan, I've been reading a really good novel recently called The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. I think she's quite an unusual, very well-regarded writer, releases a novel about once every 10 years. This book, I think, got a very good reception when it came out. It is very, very good. It's just kind of the story of this kid, young teenager growing up in New York. His mum is killed in a terrorist attack on an art gallery, the MoMA, in New York. And while he survives the attack and in the chaos and confusion and sort of when he's out of it, he decides to take down a very famous painting called The Goldfinch and steals it because just of the kind of disorientation from the blast. And then the rest of the book covers pretty much his life, everything that he goes through after the death of his mum, and also all the time he's got hidden around him this famous painting that people are looking for. It's a really interesting, just really detailed character study of this one person and all the people in his orbit. The characters are so richly developed and so believable. The dialogue is just so engrossing. It's just the tiny details. It's kind of Better Call Saul level of detail, how everything is kind of picked over and every little thing is so explained and gone into that you can't help but just be swept into and completely taken up in this world. It's a really, really interesting novel. I'd highly recommend it, but it's quite a long one, and it's mainly just this detailed character study. But it is really, really good.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I have seen it advertised around quite a lot. I do remember it being a big-ish deal when it came out. Must have been 2 or 3 years ago, I think. Yeah. But yeah, no, I know it's quite well regarded. And to be fair, it hasn't been that long since I finished Alan Moore's Jerusalem, and indeed Number 9 Dream by David Mitchell. So I've had a fair few massive brick-like literary novels lately. It sounds like it might be a good one when I finally re-emerge into the genre.
It is a long one, so I can see why you'd want to take a break from reading longer books after Jerusalem, but if you want something to really sink your teeth into, go for The Goldfinch. And also, as a writer, I think you'll appreciate the sort of tour de force in just crafting scenes, sentences, characters. Much like Dunkirk is just watching a director incredibly good at, shooting and cutting footage. Reading The Goldfinch is just reading the work of someone who's so good at crafting language. It's just a pleasure to read.
See, now I'm a slightly boy, but I'll read it and go, I kind of wish there was more plot, like a Philistine. But I guess there's only one way to find out.
Anyway, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, I have been, as fastened in the last bit, reading a slightly shorter novel. Specifically, in fact, I've read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. You may have heard of it.
It's very good.
Yeah, I borrowed it off my girlfriend. I was going to leave it a bit longer because I had got the next book the final book in the His Dark Materials series to finish, but her sister wanted to borrow it, so I moved it to the top of the pile and read it, even though I haven't yet finished the TV series. In fact, because it's airing at UK pace, as of this recording, it hasn't even finished the TV season. But yeah, it's very good. It's very, very sparse and atmospheric, and yeah, it does a lot with very little, both in terms of language and in terms of, as you may know, listeners, it's quite a short book, which makes it all the more interesting how they're going to yank years of premium telly out of it. Yeah, the book really does distill it down to a fine sort of punch. Like, The TV show, I must admit, I haven't enjoyed the TV show as much since I read the book. I'm kind of afraid of spoiling the TV show in detail, because I know you haven't seen much of it past the episode we saw for review.
No, I haven't.
But, yeah, it does... I don't know. The TV show does... Even though the TV show is quite slow-moving and thoughtful, it still ends up seeming weirdly flabby compared to the book when you read them and watch them, like, concurrently to each other. Maybe I should have waited, I don't know.
It is, a very short, very punchy book. Some of the best bits of the TV show, I think, were one of the bits when they lifted things quite sort of directly from the books. Like the scene when all the handmaidens kick the prisoner to death is very, very faithfully done from the book, and it's one of the most powerful, kind of disturbing bits of the book.
Yeah, they've done a good job of moving stuff around to repace it for TV. Like, the aforementioned scene where they kick a bloke to death is much later in the book.
Mm.
I'm not going to go into when, but it's just later. Whereas it's right there in the first episode of the TV show, and it works really well to build the world out. And to be fair, some of the stuff they've inserted for the TV show does actually work quite well, but some of it's... And again, stopping now, because I probably shouldn't go into much more detail, but yeah, it's a weird back and forth. But yeah, the book is very, very... Because it's written in this sort of dreamy monologue, which cuts from important thing to important thing, it does very much just focus on the things that matter, and yeah, homes in on the themes and what's actually being said. I mean, it's definitely a novel with a message, it's definitely, I don't know, parable might be the wrong word to describe a book that does not seem to like religion very much, but yes, the message is definitely there, and it's clear without being preachy. And yes, I gather it's a bit of a school reading list classic, so you probably don't need to be told this by me, a random man on a podcast, but it is an incredibly good book.
I think it's very high regarded. It's one of only 2 books ever that I've been reading on the tube and someone has actually tapped me on the shoulder and said, that's a great book.
I should warn you, you did use that anecdote in the review.
I know, it's my anecdote about The Handmaid's Tale, because that never happens. And even though when I see people reading sometimes my absolute favourite book on the tube, I don't go over and say anything. So that person was really motivated by love of The Handmaid's Tale.
But yeah, it's a great book, and it is... as a lot of people have said, it's a weird book to be reading in today's political climate, as maybe not outright theocracy, but alarmingly naked anger and prejudice against women or minorities starts to become depressingly semi-acceptable again in some corners of the world. And yeah, the book, as I say, because the book is a bit of a distilling it down to a point exercise, it is, if anything, even more of a clear reminder of that than the washed-out bleak thing they do on the TV show.
Yeah, it's certainly worth reading right now. It's definitely a book for our age.
Hi, this is Nick and Alastair recording for the first and possibly only, who knows, time from the Nine Worlds convention, where I've been for 2 days and Alastair's been for about 4 hours. It's been pretty good so far. It was possibly a bit of a slow start yesterday, which of course you wouldn't know about, Alastair. How's it been for you?
Yeah, it's been good so far. Today there's a lot of people around. I've been to 2 panels already, one on writing locations that you can't go to, which was really interesting. It had with a very good American author called Melissa Olson. And also been to a panel on representations of the city in science fiction and fantasy with Amy Butt, Jared Shin, Al Robertson and Verity Holloway.
Yes, which I also went to, and as someone who reads a lot of sort of, Hellblazer type stuff and a lot of police in the urban fantasy world, like the Ben Iranovich books, of course, which we've talked about at least twice before on the podcast, about, police fighting crime in a conventional London. So yeah, the representation of the city in science fiction as urban fantasy of some form seems to be kind of a dominant genre in fantasy at the moment, especially if you count all the Marvel stuff as urban fantasy.
Yeah, so certainly a reoccurring theme. This panel was really interesting. There's a lot of good debate around things like, different approaches to cities, what it's like to live in London. The people who live in a city kind of form the identity of it, not necessarily the people who are born there, the people who go there, the people who contribute to the city. There was also some interesting debates about different views on what makes the city, like sort of good versus like Victorian ideas versus modernist ideas. That inspired quite a lot of debate. They were referencing things like Le Corbusier and different architects, so I found that very interesting.
Yeah, it was good. They brought up the public-private space thing, which I think has been in The Guardian recently, about
pseudo-public spaces where the space looks public but it's owned by a corporation and your behaviour is sort of controlled and monitored. It relates back to the whole question of, are we living in a dystopia or sliding into some kind of dystopia?
To be honest, the more the panel went on talking about, how we use the city in sci-fi fantasy and how cities are now, the more it's all a dystopia, or we're living in a dystopia, or we're going towards a dystopia, seem to come up. Because, yeah, as you get in the news most days, life does seem to be sort of honing in on the point marks. Oh dear, we're living in the Hunger Games or Blade Runner, or insert the name of your favourite dystopian series here.
I thought Verity Holloway, who was one of the authors on the panel, has a lot of interesting points. I think I'll certainly be picking up one of her books.
And on a far more personal, finicky point, I found it a bit of an odd panel, as it was the first panel in which I've been stuck behind a column and unable to see the panellists' faces as they talked. So in many ways it was basically like listening to a podcast whilst in a room with a lot of people. To be fair, I could just about see Jared Shurin around the corner. He certainly emoted as he spoke. But yeah, I mean, A, shit happens. B, should probably have scoped out the geography of the room a bit more thoroughly before I sat down. Anyway, that's hardly your problem, listeners. I'm just venting. Anyway, that's been Nine Worlds Saturday so far, I think. I think we're now about to go to a panel with Mike Carey, who we've infused about before, so that'll probably be pretty good, I imagine. That's going to be predisposed to like that. And also, I think Sarah Dollard, who wrote quite a good episode of Doctor Who this series, and also a good one last series. So that's going to be fun. We may even podcast about it later. But then again, we may not. We've got to go to Wetherspoons for dinner and other important commitments. Anyway, bye for now.
Bye.
Listeners, they did not record any more audio at Nine Worlds. Okay, my recommendation for this double recommendation, slightly shorter extravaganza, is Daredevil Born Again, the very well-regarded Daredevil storyline from the 80s. This wasn't a prestige amazing graphic novel or anything, it was just, I think, 8 issues of the regular Daredevil series, written by writer Frank Miller, who has gone on to perhaps not move with the times successfully. Let's put it mildly. I'm sure we'll get into Frank Miller then and now later. But was definitely, one of the big creators of the 80s, taking control over comics, superhero comics, and especially sort of grim urban characters like Daredevil, being very much not for kids anymore. And drawn by David Mazzucchelli, who does some amazing work here. And yeah, it's basically the story of Daredevil having his life completely destroyed by the Kingpin after the Kingpin finds out his secret identity. That's not that big a spoiler. This being a classic story, we may at some point describe at least a bit the things that happen in the later stages of the storyline. So if you do want to remain completely pure and spoiler-free on Daredevil Born Again, then you may want to listen to this after you've read it. But anyway, Alastair, you've read this. I gather your exposure to Daredevil before this has been limited to the TV series and, I don't know, maybe that Ben Affleck movie.
Yeah, so the first thing, I was a bit worried about how well prepared I would be for comics Daredevil, especially when we're not starting at the beginning or anything, like we did with, say, The Amazing Spider-Man or Uber or things like that. But the TV show was a pretty good grounding. I knew all the characters, obviously, Matt Murdock stroke Daredevil, Foggy Nelson, Karen Page, the Kingpin, Ben Ulrich, the journalist. I knew enough about the world and the Daredevil and the character to get into it. But yeah, I found it was an interesting story. It certainly did a good job of explaining, like, this is seriously why superheroes keep their identity secret to stop their regular lives being totally destroyed. I did feel there were some, shall we say, Frank Millerisms that I found quite distracting and, I don't know, sort of, shall we say, problematic, to use the parlance of our time, that really did sort of stand out for me. I don't know, maybe if I'd read these when I was less aware of these issues, I'd been able to look past it, but it was difficult knowing what I know now.
It is. There are some problematic moments. I think it's easier to be slightly forgiving when you're dealing with something which was published in the little 80s 30 years ago, rather than like yesterday.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah, obviously the norms were different in the 1980s, absolutely, yeah. That's not an excuse for things like On the Buses, but there'll be plenty of time to come to Frank Miller and his particular mode of storytelling. I guess I'll start with some of the things I did really like about it, which was there was the focus on Matt Murdock as a character was really good, how it really went into detail, his sort of mental instability that had been building for a while, his madness, the way the story takes him to his lowest point, and really makes you feel for Matt as his whole life falls apart, and even his mind and everything. And then, how it kind of rebuilds him and brings him back up. There's also some very good set pieces in it, some main action sequences. There's an interesting scene when Matt Murdock has to fight someone else dressed in a Daredevil costume who's trying to corrupt the good name of Daredevil by attacking Foggy and killing him. There's an interesting fight with a villain called Nuke, who's a sort of hyped up American super soldier. There's a couple of good action sequences.
I think there's a lot of goodness in the telling. Like, I think both Miller's sort of constant narration and Mazzucchelli's art do bring it across pretty starkly. Like, there's a lot of emotion in there. There's a lot of like difficult bits they're working through, both for facial expression and through the narration. The narration of it, which is quite sort of crime noir. It's in a very sort of old school way about really talking through all the things that are happening to him. But I think it works here, partly because this is obviously, superhero via crime noir. That's clearly what Frank Miller is doing, with all the tropes and so on that brings with it. And I think he does a good job of using that. And also, there's a lot of sequences where it has like 2 or even 3 or I don't know, maybe even at some point 4 things going on at once, and it just cuts constantly between them. And I don't think it ever gets confusing. I mean, maybe this might be different for me, read lots of comics, and you read less comics, but I thought it was pretty clearly and well handled.
I would agree with that. I didn't find the plot confusing. I could follow all the various different threads, and there were a lot of plot threads. Like there was Ben's investigation, there was Matt's story, there was Foggy's story, and his relationship with an Irish woman who's not a character in the TV show. I think she's one of the few new characters.
Glory, yeah, she is a minor character from the time. I have read quite a few sort of 2000s and onwards Daredevil comics, and to the best of my recollection, that character has not endured.
Yeah. There's their plot line. There's a plot line, there's obviously with the Kingpin. There's a plot line involving Karen Page and how she sells Daredevil's identity. So, yeah, and I was able to follow the whole thing. I mean, there was some kind of regular, what you'd expect, sort of elements of a crime story. There's a criminal conspiracy built around the Kingpin, the big villain. There's various plot lines involving like corrupt cops who the Kingpin is using to conspire against Daredevil, falsifying testimony to get Matt Murdock into legal trouble. There's murders, there's cover-ups, there's like legal investigations. There's a lot of like criminal as well as superhero plot lines going in different directions, and you can follow the whole thing fairly well.
Yeah, I liked the sort of the pacing of it in that quite a lot happens. I mean, this is 8 issues of a comic, which is, I guess, quite a lot by our recommendation standards. But we read 6 issues of Descender the other week, and before that we read 7 issues of Ultimate Spider-Man, and they both go through sort of one series of origin events in their 6 to 7 issues. This, in its 8 issues, goes through this whole sort of epic sprawl. I did feel a bit more like I'd been on a journey with it than I had a lot of comics over.
Yeah, it did feel like a contained story, broken down into parts. It wasn't like... I mean, obviously, it's difficult comparing it to Ultimate Spider-Man or Descender, because them being openings of larger stories, they have to do a lot of setup. But this took an established premise. It told a complete story. I could see how the plot of Born Again could be adapted into a film, or maybe combined with a few other plot lines made into a whole series of Daredevil.
If Daredevil goes to another series or 2 or 3, I'll be amazed if they don't do this or something very heavily based on.
I much prefer them to do Born Again than more stuff with the Hand. I'm not particularly taking with the Hand, as we've discussed at least once, possibly twice. So, yeah, if they did Born Again, I think that would be a good storyline to do. Especially, obviously, they can update it to present day and not have as many Millerisms.
Yeah, I think I can confirm that, I too hope that the Hand are finished off pretty finally in the upcoming Defenders series, so that they can move on to something different in Daredevil. Ideally something a bit more crimey, like Born Again, because that's very much what I want from my Daredevil.
Is that the core of Born Again is a crime story involving the Kingpin, a literal crime kingpin. He's got a criminal empire, and he's very successful, but he's driven to distraction. In fact, he's driven to the point of pretty much throwing away his entire wealth and criminal success to pursue a vendetta against Daredevil because he hates him so much. There's a real kind of hubris story going on there. And obviously, during the course of this, he gets the one thing that gives him the huge advantage in his struggle against Daredevil is that he knows who he actually is and can target him where he's most vulnerable in his regular life by driving his friends away, by bankrupting his business, planting evidence so that he loses his license to practice law, and then his business closes, then they isolate him from his friends, and then try to corrupt and destroy the public image of Daredevil and have his friends killed, and ultimately try to kill Matt himself. It's a complete sort of descent into hell story.
Yeah, and obviously there's also this sort of quite stark religious thing going on. Like, it's called Born Again.
Yeah.
I think pretty much every chapter has a fairly portentous biblical name. And, yeah, impressively, because, it's quite easy to sink under this stuff, I think it does, the sense of the epic journey of this man from the very bottom and back up again does actually almost live up to the titles. It doesn't actually feel like it's, like we've said about other things before, like it's aiming high and then plopping gently at the feet.
Yeah, I mean, the titles are things like Revelation, Apocalypse, Purgatory. But also the character of Matt Murdock, he's Irish Catholic, essentially the character in the TV show as well as in the comic. And when he's at his lowest point, he's living on the streets, so then ends up in a mission and is cared for by nuns and nursed back to health. And obviously there's a sense of him reconnecting with his faith and his childhood, as well as, reconnecting with the person that he is deep down inside, which allows him to kind of rebuild from his lowest point, be born again, and then be born again into Daredevil in a sense. so that to the point where he can put the costume back on and then, obviously fight against the villainous forces and ultimately triumph.
And do a massive big superhero bit in the last couple of chapters.
Yeah, and then in the end it gets full Marvel Cinematic Universe with Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America turn up, which I was not expecting, actually, for something that had been so determinedly just a story about Daredevil. No kind of winks or nods to other things, which they do like in the films and the TV shows. To have basically kind of Captain America and Thor turn up at the end, and that was unexpected.
Yeah, I remember finding it a bit more jarring when I first read this, when I think I might have been about 16, 17. But yeah, no, I quite liked it this time, to be honest. I quite liked the sense of him, having this great big triumph. There was quite a lot of emphasis on the way the battle between Daredevil and this big villain they brought in, the Nuke character, actually affected the surrounding area and the people of Hell's Kitchen, which I think was quite nicely played. And there's some Captain America stuff which chimes quite well with what you like in your Captain America stories, where he, questions the use of the flag.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of a tonal swing, but I think they just about pulled it off. And obviously, again, Mazzucchelli's artwork swings beautifully from this sort of man sitting on a bed in a shelter, questioning the nature of his life, to Daredevil and Captain America punching a big dude, and just does it all pretty flawlessly.
Yeah, I think it does certainly up the epic for the final confrontation. Yeah, to basically bring in a kind of a bigger, sort of more badass villain, and to also, bring in other superheroes, especially to have extended kind of Captain America appearance. But yeah, I suppose it links the story into the wider universe in that this new villain, Nuke, is supposed to be another super soldier from this sort of similar program that created Captain America, but this one's the villain.
Yeah, I think Nuke has been used in other bits and bobs, but it doesn't really matter. This was his first appearance, so I think this is what the main thing he's remembered for being the sort of nihilistic mock super soldier in this final bit. I mean, to an extent, he's clearly just here to give Daredevil a big thing to triumphantly punch, but I think they put enough thought into actually developing an interesting villain which has a certain sort of satirical edge to it, but it doesn't feel entirely empty.
Yeah, and it's kind of built up slowly how, as you see the Kingpin's criminal empire grow, there's various bits where he talks about how he gets involved with the military, and he has a general on his sort of payroll at one point and things like that. Do you want to take some time to talk about a few of the more problematic elements of this comic?
I've praised it pretty glowingly for a while, so yeah, why not? Let's do it.
There's two obvious things. One, I'd say, is there is a lot of violence against women in this comic. The character of Karen gets pretty much beaten up in every issue at one point or another. And it's usually just even though sometimes it's unnecessarily violent, even for supposed to be a gritty crime story. There's one bit when, I don't know actually how much detail I should go into, because obviously people listening to this podcast understandably may not want me to go into descriptions of this sort of thing. So let's just say I think some of the casual violence meted out towards Karen character especially is unnecessary. There's lots of even just supporting characters that get hurt. There's one bit when Nuke gets angry when he's on a flight to America when he's going to fight Daredevil, and he just sort of assaults a stewardess, and it's just thrown in there as a kind of oh, it's a minor character thing. He just randomly assaulted that woman because he's that kind of guy. And there's even a bit when the Kingpin's talking and something like that, and he just casually mentions that he's had someone's daughter's arm broken, and it's just you just can't go any time without mentioning violence against women. And first of all, it's not really explored or developed or anything like that. It's not contrast this to a film like Tyrannosaur, which also has a lot of violence against women in it, because it's a film that is about domestic violence and abusive relationships and the dynamics of them. That's not what Miller's doing here.
No, he's writing a comic about Daredevil.
Exactly. So he's sprinkling violence. I mean, by all means, be violent and stuff. But it's just this casual sprinkling of violence against women to give it this kind of gritty, nasty edge. And there's also the fact that the women never get a chance to do any fighting of their own. They're always just victims. They're always just being pushed around and hit by men. I mean, there's even a bit when there's an ambush in a prison and some characters are caught off guard by some dirty cops with guns. And Ben Ulrich, he, even though he's unarmed, he springs into life, grabs a gun off someone and beats a dirty cop to death with it because he's a man, so therefore he can stand up for himself. Whereas Glory in that scene pretty much just does nothing. So, yeah, I think that's a sort of an aspect of the comic that hasn't aged particularly well.
Yeah, I see the genre he's working in and the tropes he's invoking, but yes, they are tropes that haven't perhaps aged massively well at this stage in society. And yeah, he's clearly not trying to subvert them, because he is somewhat just bathing in it.
Yeah, and the other thing I guess is also there's the plot line of Karen, who we remember from the the TV show, the fact that she is a heroin addict and now a prostitute.
Is it prostitute or porn star?
It seems to be a bit of both.
Yeah.
He says that she went to Hollywood to be in films, and the films, I think, gradually got worse until she was in pornos, and then now it's just a junkie and a prostitute, by the looks of it.
I can see the plot he's tried to do, but ultimately you could have got she sold his secret identity for a fix of heroin without needing to go, full porn star.
Yeah. And there's several bits in the comic when Karen trades sexual favours for things such as, heroin, but also passage from wherever she is back to New York. I think she's in New Orleans. Is there anything in the background of this character or the previous appearance of this character to suggest this is a direction her life could have taken? Pornography and heroin addiction? Because it's not something that befalls a wide range of people.
Well, I think she left the comic to go and become a star in Hollywood. She was a Stan Lee character created in the 60s, so was somewhat portrayed as a bit of a silly, naive young girl, because Stan Lee comics in the 60s were not always known for their devastating degree of enlightenment. But, yeah, she goes sort of twinkly-eyed off to become a star, and then when she next appears, she's, it's gone the way you said. So, it's not a complete character reversal, but a lot of it is just stuff Frank Miller's pulled out to make his story work, yeah.
Which is, it's kind of like a Frank Miller hallmark that there must be prostitutes and things like that in his stories.
This was maybe not an early Frank Miller work, but certainly before his hallmarks or his recurring tropes have become quite as much of a general joke.
I guess because in this story he's writing Daredevil, so the story is constrained by what he's doing is constrained by the fact that it has to meet the Daredevil requirements. I think, as with other writers, when they move on from these established characters to create their own worlds and their own characters, that's when they get to realize their own vision, is one way of putting it. And obviously, we've seen how, in other things we've covered, how people have written mainstream superhero stuff and then taken their kind of take on mainstream superheroes over to, an indie publication to create, something more based around that. And I think you can see the elements that Frank Miller was writing about in Daredevil that obviously became like the basis for like Sin City or things that are wholly his creation and not, working with something Stan Lee created. Sin City is also completely liberally spotted with unnecessary violence against women as well, so you can draw out those themes.
Well, you can go to bat for a certain amount of Sin City and go, this is amazingly done comics, even if the content is a bit trashy, to put it mildly.
So yeah, it was interesting because this is the first time I'd read any Frank Miller. I have seen the film of Sin City. Don't believe I've read anything that he'd written before, so especially going back, and certainly nothing this far back in his career.
Yeah, I mean, the tone and stuff might be quite familiar from Daredevil in other media, because the Frank Miller take has, from like Born Again and his previous work on the series, where he introduced Elektra and did a load of stuff with the hand, and unlike many other people, actually did good stuff with the hand. It's basically just him and no one else. Oh, that's bullshit, someone probably has, but yeah, good hand stories are few and far between. But anyway, yeah, the Frank Miller take has been pretty massively influential. I mean, there's a reason why you read this and go, I remember all these characters from the TV show. Yeah, that's because people always use the Frank Miller characters in all the adaptations, because the Frank Miller stuff is the most well-remembered stuff.
Yeah, did he create the Kingpin?
No, the Kingpin was actually a Spider-Man villain, but as Daredevil became more a sort of urban crime guy rather than a swashbuckling fight the supervillains guy, Kingpin sort of moved over to become a Daredevil villain in a sort of weird natural progression.
I can see why, if they were going to do in the Netflix version, they're going to do more Kingpin stories. Born Again would be a good one, because at the point they've left him in the TV show, I guess spoilers if you haven't seen it, he's in prison and it's Daredevil's fault, so I can imagine he would become angry and vindictive towards him, and that would naturally lead to this sort of story.
Well, yeah, I mean, about the only thing stopping him just doing Born Again in the next season is that unless there are some pretty rapid developments in Defenders, he's in prison and doesn't have the power to pull off the massive conspiracy he does here. Well, I mean, to be fair, but if Netflix actually, sped up the pace in their series for once, they could probably do The Kingpin Rises to Power and then The Kingpin does Born Again in a single season, but that's a wait and see.
Yeah. Again, it would be combined with other plot lines, to make it out to 13 episodes.
But yeah, no, I've no idea when Daredevil Season 3 is happening. I think it has been confirmed that's happening, so we may have to wait a while for that one. I'm guessing next year at the earliest.
Probably. The other thing is that this is the first comic I believe I read that has the very iconic sort of colouring and art style of the people associated with comics. The one that I'm most familiar with from Roy Lichtenstein's painting based on comics of the 50s and 60s. And I don't think I've read anything using that before, and it was quite nice to finally go look at it.
It's mostly the colouring, to be honest, because, colouring with computers, where you could have more sort of radiation and stuff, that came in really heavily in the 90s, to the point where it was kind of overused to death, and then became actually good in sort of the late 90s, and onwards, to the point where colouring is basically an art form in itself at this stage. I mean, colourists are given a lot of the credit they deserve and often given cover credits and stuff. But yeah, this is classic colouring, so mostly flat colours. And, it works pretty well for this sort of stark thing that Miller and Mazzucchelli are doing here. Even though it isn't quite sort of classic superhero, it's a bit more sort of, depressing.
Yeah, but it works very well. It's nice to look at, something I haven't read before, as we focus on, I think, more recent things.
Well, yeah, I've not leaned hard on the sort of old Marvel DC stuff because, I don't know, superheroes, they're sometimes a bit impenetrable. But, we had to start somewhere.
No, that was good. Well, it's good to start with something that I was familiar with from the TV shows. I already had a background, which did make it much more accessible. Especially, as you say, the version I've seen of this character is based on this Frank Miller version because it's the version everyone seems to like. Next, we'll be discussing Withnail and I, starring Richard E. Grant, Paul McGann, and Richard Griffiths. The film is set in the 1960s about two struggling actors who live in a flat in Camden in abject poverty due to their lack of success as acting. Between taking drugs, drinking lots of booze, and associating with some of the more colourful characters of the Camden crime scene, they realise their lives are spinning out of control and decide that they need to get away to the countryside. And the only way they can do this on their budget is by staying at Withnail's uncle's cottage. However, when the uncle himself turns up with sexual desires, shall we say, for the Paul McGann character, things get quite awkward over a rainy weekend in Penrith in the Lake District. This film came out in 1987 and set in the 1960s. It's a classic slice of 80s British cinema. It's achieved cult status for its humour, its unusual music, and its bizarre take on the 60s actor and drug scene. So this is one of my favourite films. I really like it. I rewatch it quite regularly. It makes me laugh a lot, and I really like the characters. But Nick, what did you think after seeing it for the first time?
It was fun. It was weird. I watched this twice because the first time I felt like I don't know if I just wasn't in the mood, and me and its sense of humour just sort of missed each other like ships passing in the night. But yeah, it's kind of like Nathan Barley. In fact, it reminds me quite a bit of Nathan Barley. Maybe just because I was watching them both at the same time, or maybe just because we were discussing Nathan Barley like an hour ago in real time, so that it's just fresh on me. But yeah, the sort of slightly grim, doomed vision of London, except, in a sort of 80s way rather than a... Well, no, it's set in the 60s, isn't it? It's meant to be set in the 60s.
It's set in the 1960s, yeah. It's set in 1969.
Yeah, the sort of doomed, destructive friendship thing. It was kind of interesting watching it unravel. I'm still never entirely sure I actually got round to finding most of it funny, though. They just sort of talked a lot in a slightly vaguely entertaining, rambling way.
There's some interesting writing and stuff. It's written some bits are written in a very flowery way, especially the Monty character, who's very, very over the top. And he has these, I think, wonderful speeches when he says things like that. We live in the days of weather forecasts and breakfasts that set in. Shot on by Tories, shuffled up by Labour. We three are the last beautiful island in existence. Something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's a lot of flowery over the top language. There's a lot of references back to things in the characters' pasts as well that, similar to some of the things we talked about in the last episode, you never really get fully explained what the deal with Monty's backstory is, or really how the two characters of Withnail and I met and become friends, or even much the deals of their friendship. There's a thing sort of implied in the film that they might actually be living together as a couple, which is some of the characters think, but it's not particularly denied by the two main characters. In fact, there's one point when the Paul McGann character actually, in order to get rid of Monty, he plays on the fact that he's in a relationship with Withnail. And you're never really sure if that's actually in the one moment in the film when he's truthful about how he feels about Withnail, or if it's just, more lies to Monty. So I think they've got an interesting relationship that you kind of see the edge of. You don't really get to know, but there's something bonding the two together and also sort of driving them apart as well.
Yeah, it gets sort of a bit more plot driven, I guess, from about when Monty shows up at the cottage and then it sort of drives on to the end. Before that, it's this sort of series of, I don't know, is skits the right word?
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Extended scenes of the two of them trying to do things and mostly fucking it
living in poverty in London. There's a bit at the beginning, one of my favourite bits is then the Paul McGann character is eating what you think is soup on the couch, and Withnail's like, you've got soup, why don't I have soup? And then the Paul McGann character goes like, it's coffee, because they haven't got anything to eat at all. It's the most studenty film ever because they never have money for anything, clothes, rent, food, but they never seem to run out of booze or fags or drugs. It seems to be iconic student living, pretty much.
It's a small amount of research I did around this. Did keep using phrases like undergraduate favourite. So is this the film you went to watch when you were at university and you sort of watch this film and dream that your life's going to be that way forever? Is that the appeal?
Yeah, or you watch the film when you're leading a maybe slightly tamer, more university-based version of that existence. Should be careful what I say, because my mum just listens to this podcast.
But yeah, I'm conscious that this is the second student favourite film, which seems to revolve heavily around characters who consume a lot of alcohol or substances, which I've sort of been a bit sort of, am I too old for this? Have I missed the boat? Am I not drunk enough or stoned enough? 15 years too late and 15 times too sober? Is this the problem I've hit? Because there's lots of fun dialogue, and visually God's clearly, very charismatic and very bodily throwing himself into this part. He gets a lot of the good lines with the I character, who's never named, is he? He's just I.
So he never gets a name in the film. I do actually have the script, a copy of it, and he's got a name in the script. I think he's called Marwood, and I think fans of the film call the character Marwood.
Yeah.
Even though in the film his name's never mentioned, and it just says I in the end credits.
Yeah, it says I on the back of my DVD as well.
Yeah, but I think fans refer to the character as Marwood, I think, because that's what he's called in the script.
I think my favourite scene in the first half of the film, before the plot gets a bit more going, is the one where he goes to the pub and with his boots perfumed for, as far as I can see, no reason. This is the Marwood/I character. And he goes to the toilet and this bloke shouts, "Pants!" at him on the way past. And then he sort of stands in the toilet, sort of nervously pissing, and having this sort of tortured in a monologue about if and how he should leave this toilet. And that was, I mean, maybe I've revealed too much of myself by expressing my enjoyment of that scene, but that was very much yes, I feel you now, Marwood, I feel you.
That's also followed up by the great bit when the guy tries to have a confrontation with them both, and it shows how Withnail is just such the biggest coward in the universe, and is pretty much just offering the Paul McGann character to this guy to beat up, just because Withnail is so spineless he won't even stand up for his friend. A lot of the scrapes they get into is because of Withnail's refusal to tell people the truth or to confront anyone in any way, particularly Uncle Monty, who Withnail just lies to a lot to get what he wants and stuff. But then when all the consequences are visited upon Marwood, obviously Withnail doesn't really do anything about it, which is why things kind of spiral out of control so rapidly.
Yeah, obviously, yes. One of the things that I think makes the ending work for me, and sort of the general journey of it work, is the fact that, it goes through the inevitable realisation that Withnail is the Robert Webb from Peep Show, Nathan Barley, ultimately a bit of an unreliable dick who probably has it coming of the story, and suffering is ultimately visited upon him, and people around him ultimately realise they're probably better off without him, which doesn't really stop it being too much of a weird wish fulfillment thing, because I think we've all, and again I speak very much for myself, thought we're as brilliantly witty as Withnail clearly thinks he is when we've had several drinks, only to discover, sometimes because you've, say, recorded yourself whilst drunk for your podcast, but actually no, you're not. You weren't that funny. There are some recordings you'll never hear, listeners. Yeah,
definitely we've all sort of been there and stuff, and it is a great film about being drunk and the exuberance people have when they're drunk, which is also interesting because Richard E. Grant's actually, I think, allergic to alcohol, so he's sober the whole time, and I don't think he's really ever drunk much in his life. It's just pure good performing.
Maybe I'm underestimating most actors and their need to method, but I don't know. I've always kind of assumed that most actors, when they're playing drunk, are definitely not actually drunk, or at the very least, they've had like one glass rather than 3 or 4, because I don't think drunk acting would really work. I think the command of your body required would probably be the first thing to go if you were more than a little bit pissed.
Yeah, I think you're right, but they will probably base their performances on their own experience, but obviously Richard E. Grant has no experience to base the performance on, just, I guess, like actors do, watching and studying other people.
Well, he's allergic to alcohol. He's probably been on plenty of nights out, but he's the sober one, watching drunk people throw themselves around and fall into traffic, so
there is that.
There's that level of observational material for him to draw on.
Yeah, there is that. There are so many great quotes in this film. I think one of the reasons why students love it is it's just so quotable, and students like nothing more than to get drunk and to exuberantly quote things at people, and everything like the Penwith tea rooms. There's the whole thing with the poacher, which the first time I watched this film, I found the poacher genuinely quite menacing, especially the bit when they come back and he's like hanging around their house. We'll hang around the cottage in the Lake District. He comes across as quite scary. Did you find the poacher menacing?
Yeah, he was clearly a bit gruff, but on the other hand, Withnail was being quite annoying. He didn't strike me as overreacting to as a random person in the countryside who some drunk guy from the city had come up to and started barking at.
Yeah, there's so many great scenes, the bits with the poacher, the bits with the bull, the bit when they get arrested driving back to London. So, I mean, there's too many good ones to name here.
I did enjoy that it actually paid off the... there's a bit in the first half of the film involving a urination device, which is paid off later in the sort of bleak, damp way you'd expect. It's pretty
fun. That is funny, and obviously they loop it back round the end of the film back to the beginning by bringing back presuming Ed and Danny the dealer with the famous Camberwell carrot scene. So I mean, there's lots and lots of great scenes, but what I love, I think one of the things I love the most about this film is the kind of encapsulation of the 1960s, like the soundtrack of Beatles songs and Hendrix songs and the Mark II or Mark I Jag the sort of battered and destroyed one that they drive around in. And for me, the whole film is most brilliantly summed up in the bit when they leave the flat in Camden for the first time and you just hear Hendrix playing. They drive out into the road and Paul McGann puts on his sort of aviator shades and they hit the road, and it's such a cool epitome of the 1960s.
And then does the wrecking ball then start smashing up buildings behind?
Yeah, well, it's the 60s like slum clearance that was going on after the war when they were pulling down loads of buildings to... it's not their building that's been pulled down, but they were pulling down buildings to build blocks of council flats and things like that. So the 60s council blocks are now obviously an iconic part of the London landscape, but they were being built back then. And a lot of the sort of grotty tenements that Withnail and I live in were being pulled down and stuff, which is ironic because the ones that did survive are now very, very desirable properties, and the sort of decaying Victorian or Georgian terrace that Withnail and I live in pretty much absolute squalor, would now be an incredibly valuable and posh place to live, just off Camden. Back then, well, even in the 80s, but definitely in the 60s, it was a poor area where sort of, struggling actors would live on very little.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I say, it didn't really ooze 60s cool for me, considering that every scene pretty much bashed me over the head with the shitty squalor of their existence, except that one bit where they went to Monty's house.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was the sort of, I mean, the one impression it sort of generally creates is this sort of melancholy. I mean, again, it's sort of, I don't know, maybe of a type with something like Peep Show in a way, and there's just this directionless, we're sort of stuck with each other sense. And I know that's just sort of a classic comedy relationship. That's a reason why these all sort of resemble each other.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I know, I've tried to write them myself. It's hard to get it right. And this is one of the ones that nails it the most, in that there's clearly a deep affection and love the characters have for each other, but also they can't stand each other and are constantly at each other's throats. It's a beautiful film about friendship.
I mean, the upside of it being a film rather than a 6 to 8 series TV show, I guess, is you don't have to quite deal with but why does the sensible one still put up with the annoying one? Why? Which you do kind of get to by some of the later, slightly less good series of Peep Show, but this film gets to the sort of draw a line under and move on.
Yeah. Withnail can't escape from this life. Marwood realises that he has to escape or else he'll die.
Yeah.
The original ending of the film actually was that Richard E. Grant, Withnail character, would go home, fill a shotgun with wine, drink it and blow his head off. But I think the actual ending of him just being left in a park, standing there with a bottle of wine, shouting Shakespeare at a zoo, is actually just so beautifully sad that I can't see how anything would be better than that.
I think him blowing his own head off would perhaps be a bit... I mean, the film is pretty melancholy and sad, and it wouldn't be entirely out of place, but I can see why they perhaps decided not to go quite that far. Yeah,
I just love the sadness of it. It is beautifully sad. It's just the way, especially the end, the way it's just sort of, it kind of underpins it, the muted colour scheme, the rain and the constant rain and the drizzle, and it's just very, I just find it really movingly how sad the film is. So, yeah.
I don't know if I ever quite got a beautiful film about friendship to the extent that it was so bleak the whole time that I was a bit sort of, I don't know. You can sort of to an extent see why the I character doesn't just leg it, but there's something quite sort of punishing about the whole friendship in a way. And yeah, as I say, because it doesn't have, an ongoing series to service, it can at least take it to the logical conclusion.
Yeah, it wraps itself up very nicely, neatly. And, after being quite funny at times and stuff, like especially the sort of sequence before the final sequence when they're back in the flat with the Camberwell carrot, it's got a lot of great jokes in it, and then it kind of stops right at the end for a moment of poignancy.
Yeah. Also, in terms of 80s things that might be a bit problematic in retrospect, probably wasn't sure if Uncle Monty being the sort of older gay man being basically portrayed as a sex pest is as funny now as it would have been in the 80s.
Yeah, it's a character that probably hasn't aged very well, how he is pretty determined to have sex with the Paul McGann character. And obviously homosexuality was illegal at the time. Oh, it's set? Hang on.
In the 60s?
I don't think it was, actually. It was legalised 50 years to go today, so that would be the 1960s. Okay, that's wrong. It would have been legal. I think you're right that were this to be made today, even if it was set in the 1960s, they would probably approach that character differently. Richard Griffiths does play it very well and does deliver some amazing monologues.
Oh yeah, as yeah, as with Frank Miller in comics, Richard Griffiths in acting, yeah, I'm not saying he does the problematic thing badly. It's a very funny character at times. He does definitely, bring the performance.
But yeah, you're right. It is a portrayal of homosexuality that, like I say, is problematic in the sense that it's quite a negative portrayal, of Monty being driven by lust and desire to the point of not really respecting anyone else.
But yes, anyway, that's definitely an interesting sort of cultural artifact. And as I say, I perhaps watched it more enjoyed it, I guess, more as a sort of depressing vision than as you can't see me, but I'm doing wanky air quotes, comedy. But yeah, it was definitely an interesting film.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those staple British independent films that's part of the kind of the core watch list. I'm glad you got a chance to see it.
Yep. As I say, maybe if I was 15 years younger and had done a lot more weed, I might have appreciated it more, but no, it was a fun thing to finally watch.
I'm glad you found Withnail and I interesting. In the next episode, we'll be back to our regular format. So what would you be recommending to me?
Right, well, from 80s things that have both got slight problematic elements, we move to a fairly modern show that is definitely trying to, if anything, redress that balance in the media. This is the Netflix sitcom Master of None, starring Aziz Ansari, best known for his role as Tom in Parks and Rec, and yes, playing Dev, a character trying to navigate life as a young Indian man in America. Yeah, it got a lot of buzz last year. I don't know if you've already seen it.
I have not seen it, although everyone keeps telling me to see it and really, really highly recommends it. So it's pretty much criminal that I haven't seen it yet. So I'm glad I get the chance to now.
Yep. No, it's a great show. It's a sitcom, so the episodes pretty much stand alone. But yeah, I just hammer through a few of them, get a feel for it. And yeah, Master of None. It's good. Enjoy.
Excellent.
Okay, and that's all the moderate fantasy violence for today, and considering this is the end of a mammoth double recording session, it does feel like we've really been through something. But yeah, if you want more, then you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, and there are the episodes, some blog posts, some outtakes, and you could also go and find us on iTunes or other podcatching services, where if you felt like leaving a review so other people can find the show, it would genuinely help us to get more listeners. Thank you.
You can also find us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, or on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. Our audience survey should now be complete. The winner of the £20 Amazon gift voucher will be contacted soon, if you haven't been contacted already. So yeah, congratulations to you, winner.
If only we were recording this in the future so we could say your name.
Yes, you are out there right now.
Well done.
I've been Alastair Ball. If you want more of my stuff, you can follow me on Twitter at AlastairJRBall, or you can visit my website, redtrainblog.com.
And I've been Nick Bryan. I too have a website at nickbryan.com where I post my fiction, and hopefully some will be coming soon. I'm also on Twitter as @NickMB. And that really is the end. Join us in what will be about 4 weeks for us, but a mere 2 weeks for you, when we will be discussing the Defenders series, of course, the epic Marvel Netflix team-up, Atomic Blonde, and we'll be seeing what Alastair thought of Master of None. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, on the one hand, in the 2 weeks between us recording and me editing this episode, nothing major has happened regarding Born Again or Withnail and I. On the other hand, the world does seem to be inching closer to nuclear Armageddon, so swings and roundabouts really, isn't it?